Okay, welcome everyone to another YIVO Fellowship Lecture. Today's lecture is the Max Weinreich Fellowship Lecture in Polish Jewish Studies. It was sponsored by the Alexander and Alicia Hertz Memorial Fellowship and the Samuel and Flora Weiss Research Fellowship. And if you like what you see, please consider making a donation to YIVO. We can't bring you these fellowship lectures, and we can't fund our fellows without your help. Which obviously we very much appreciate. Once again, if you do have questions during the lecture, please leave them in the Q&A section of the chat. Today's lecturer is Alison B. Curry. She is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to that, she received her MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Gratz College and a graduate certificate in digital public humanities from George Mason University. Curry's dissertation research focuses on the ritual, spatial, and functional uses of Jewish cemeteries in Poland between 1918 and 1945. Currently, Curry is a Saul Kagan Fellow in Advanced Shoah Studies, as well as the 2022-2023 Max Weinreich Center Fellow in Polish Jewish Studies at the YIVO Institute. Her research has also been supported by the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture. Her lecture today is entitled Between the Living and the Dead, Considering Tradition in the Jewish Cemeteries of Poland, 1918 to 1945. Please join me in welcoming Alison Curry.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Okay. So I first want to thank YIVO, not only for the opportunity to present my research today, but also for the opportunity to conduct research at the Center for Jewish History earlier this year. I had a wonderful time in New York City, and I'm very grateful to be the 2022 to 2023 Max Weinreich Fellow in Polish Jewish Studies. And also, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I appreciate everyone for being here. Today's presentation comes from the first chapter of my dissertation, which is still very much in progress. My dissertation stems from 6 or so trips to Poland over the past 11 years, in which I've been fortunate enough to visit around 25 different Jewish cemeteries around the country. Ultimately, my dissertation aims to assess the function of Jewish cemeteries in Poland across 2 time periods. First, what is often referred to as the interwar period, or between 1918 and 1939. And second, the period of the Second World War in Poland, 1939 to 1935. My dissertation takes a thematic approach to analysis of Jewish cemeteries in Poland by examining the ritual use of Jewish cemeteries, the cemetery as space, movement of peoples between and to cemeteries, and finally, the actors involved in the use of these spaces. This presentation shares pieces of my first chapter on ritual uses of the Jewish cemetery. The Jewish cemetery is a space that is structured by ritual and tradition. The cemetery serves essential functions to many societies. At its foundation, the cemetery is an essential space in a community as it gives them a place to bury the dead. It also serves as a place for the living to mourn the deceased. The Jewish cemetery also fulfills these specific functions, but additionally, is a space in which many other rituals, specific to Jewish law and tradition, are performed. While I do not have time today to explore each of these, my presentation will examine various rituals and traditions pertaining to funeral and burial. This talk utilizes various types of documents, including newspaper articles, Z-score books, documents saved from ghettos, memoirs, and diaries from archives in both Poland and the United States. First, I feel it is important to talk briefly about ritual and tradition. For the purposes of my research, I have found anthropologist Vanessa Och's definition of ritual most useful. She defines ritual as, quote, conventional or patterned ways of doing things that have shared and often multiple meanings, unquote. In addition, Ochs adds that rituals are also, quote, products of time, a place, available physical materials, and appealing practices of other peoples, unquote. This definition reminds us that ritual is guided by context. Though Jewish rituals often have roots in Jewish religious law, many have been changed or altered depending on time or place. And because rituals can be created, remade, or altered, their meaning and significance varies. While many rituals are tradition, the term tradition itself is even broader and maybe more harder to define. In her book, On the Edge of Destruction, historian Celia Heller wrote that Jewish traditionalism was a method of keeping, quote, the people physically and spiritually intact, unquote. Though Heller notes this as being central to the establishment of the Kahila, or the Jewish community, in the 17th century, I still feel this statement is applicable to the 20th, and explains why I find tradition to be a compelling source for understanding aspects of Polish Jewish life in the 20th century. This talk begins in the interwar period, where we will see how pressures of modernity and urbanization in Poland strained traditional practices at the Jewish cemetery. While during the interwar period, specific aspects of funerals, burials, and cemetery usage relied less and less on Jewish tradition and law, with the start of the Second World War, caring for bodies after death became both a priority and a triviality. Handling the ever-increasing numbers of the deceased in the ghetto meant that, in many cases, various death traditions were abandoned altogether. On the other hand, the sanctity of Jewish tradition and ethics emboldened many activists to call for returns to traditional practices of funeral and burial during the Holocaust. Ultimately, I argue that the Jewish cemetery became a central space for negotiation of identity and consideration of tradition, spaces in which the living contemplated their own Jewishness, reflected in that of the dead. One final note before I begin, my research focuses on some difficult subjects, sometimes with detailed graphic descriptions. I make a point not to show incredibly graphic photographs of the Jewish deceased in presentations, but I also just want to throw out a content warning before I share some of this research. The best place for this presentation to begin is through an examination of Jewish funerals in the interwar period, where Polish Jews attempted to cement their identity in the traditions associated with death. Sources evidenced in this section show that funerals were significant occasions for Jews in Poland before World War II. Immense crowds would join the funeral processions, entire cities would shut down, and people from around the country would flock to urban centers for funerals. And because these events highlighted an individual's identity, they also became significant sites for conflict in the interwar period, usually between Jewish political groups and the broader Jewish community. Through an examination of the ritual practices and funerals that took place in the interwar period, this portion of the talk will show how funerals became central sites for the celebration of the individual and for negotiation of identity. It was within the cemetery that Jewish communities wrestled with aspects of Jewish tradition and law in relation to their own identity, which Jewish traditions would be followed, and which could be altered if necessary. In Judaism, the funeral serves both the deceased and the community. The deceased is respected and remembered through a proper burial, while the loved ones are given space to grieve, mourn, and experience the support of community. The funeral and burial of the body is known as accompanying the deceased. The procession itself is one of the most important steps in the funeral, as accompanying the dead to their burial place is considered a mitzvah or a commandment under Jewish law. In interwar Poland, Jewish funeral processions became significant spaces for political and ideological identification. Nowojennik, a Polish-language daily newspaper, published an article on January 15, 1928, describing the funeral of Noah Davidson, a Zionist Jew in Warsaw. In the case of this funeral, where the funeral procession began, who made up the majority of the procession, and the symbolism of the funeral was guided by the deceased's identity as a Zionist. In 1935, the funeral of Joseph Leszczynski, a Polish Jewish writer and leader of the Jewish socialist movement, was a spectacle complete with a procession of banners and wreaths, a band playing revolutionary airs, and a hearse covered with a red flag as it made its way to the Okopowa Street Jewish Cemetery in Warsaw. The political identification of the deceased before their death often led to heightened symbolism and even additions of ritual or traditions to their funeral procession that were not necessarily Jewish in origin. Such additions or changes to the funeral procession at times led to conflict within Jewish communities. Such was the case in May 1927 during the funeral of Felix Perl, a Jewish leader of the Polish Socialist Party in Warsaw. According to an article in the Reform Advocate, prior to Perl's funeral, the Polish Socialist Party, quote, had obtained the permission of the Kahila executive for a catafalque decked with flags and wreaths to be a part of the procession, on the condition that the traditional Jewish hearse, the agola, precede the catafalque, unquote. Though this agreement had been reached, during the procession, members of the Polish Socialist Party actually forced the Jewish hearse into the rear, permitting the catafalque to proceed ahead of the procession. According to this source, the executive of the Warsaw Kahila complained about this action to the leader of the Polish Socialist Party after the funeral. Just as the funeral procession was a central ritual through which an individual's identity was highlighted, the burial ceremony itself was also a space where Jews inserted aspects of their own identity. There were some features of the burial ceremony that were quite traditional and therefore common in many funerals during the interwar period. Within the Vengrove Yiskor book is a description of one very traditional burial ceremony. Quote, "The head of the burial society himself buried the corpse, placing 2 small pieces of wood in the corpse's hands and laying an earthenware shard on each eye. Boards were laid on top, earth was shoveled into the grave, and a board was placed in the ground at the head of the grave, bearing the name of the dead person, the date of birth, and the date of death. Everyone said, 'From dust you came, and to dust you return. Blessed be the true judge.'" Unquote. Whereas this description of burial contains very traditional funeral prayers and customs, burial and funerary rituals were often decided by the deceased themselves in the interwar period. Ansky, the famous writer and folklorist, determined in his will that his own funeral would forego the recitation of traditional funeral orations, as well as the placing of flowers on his casket. Instead, someone read a biography of his life, and a performer from the Vilna theater said the Kaddish. In the town of Sohachev, local burial society member Freiman Hirsch Friedman made an interesting request in his will. Along with other very traditional requests, Friedman asked that the, quote, "sack which is placed at the head of the grave should be filled instead of earth, but with the charitable receipts that he collected throughout the years from his donation to various yeshivot and charities, along with his circumcision knife," unquote. The variations in these funeral descriptions point to the significance of the individual. The deceased prior to death was often given the option of the rituals performed at their own burial and which traditions they would include or exclude. As with funeral processions, the burial ceremony itself became a central space for conflict in the interwar period. One such instance of conflict over burial occurred at Warsaw's Okopowa Street Jewish Cemetery between 2 Hasidic dynasties. In June 1928, a fight erupted between the descendants of Rebbe Mendel, the Rebbe of the town of Varka, over the last 2 remaining burial plots in his burial chapel. One of the plots had been set aside for Rebbe Benjamin, one of Rebbe Mendel's grandsons, and the Rebbe of the town of Otbosk. However, there was contention over the second available burial plot. The Rebbe of the town of Skierniewice wanted the second plot for his own son, Levi Yitzhak, who died at 20 years of age. However, the followers of the Otbosk Rebbe wanted that plot reserved for their current Rebbe when he should die. They also argued that Levi Yitzhak could not be given that plot because it went against traditional custom for an unmarried man to be buried in the Rebbe's chapel. The followers of the Otbosk Rebbe consulted the Warsaw rabbinate on this issue, and they decided that the grave plot should in fact go to Levi Yitzhak. Shocked and outraged, on the day of his funeral, the followers of the Otbosk Rebbe occupied the burial chapel and refused the burial of Levi Yitzhak. When the funeral attendees approached the chapel, the occupiers threw stones and pieces of wood to stop their approach. After some time, the occupiers were removed and the burial continued, though greatly delayed. These above incidents highlight some compelling points about funerary ritual in the interwar period. First, funerals were significant spaces of identity and ideology. Individuals saw their funeral as a time to emphasize their life work, political affiliation, or even religious ideology. This emphasis at funerals in the interwar period then often led to significant conflicts at the cemetery. The significance of the funerary rituals and the space these rituals occupied led to hostility between Jewish groups. The conflict over the burial chapel showcases just how salient these rituals were to Jewish communities. In this case, the space of a burial plot and who owned it was important enough to a religious community of Jews that they would delay the burial of another Jew. Funerals were salient spaces through which conflict was negotiated for 2 reasons. One, because they tied directly to the deceased's individuality, often their political and religious identity. And 2, because funerals were the most public of Jewish death rituals. Funeral processions often took place on the public street on the way to the cemetery, meaning that this ritual would have been the most prominent to the non-Jewish community in a town as well. During the interwar period, when it came to funerary ritual, Jewish tradition was wrestled with, contested, and sometimes abandoned. Beginning in the mid-1920s, Jews in interwar Poland became very concerned with an ongoing phenomenon that the Jewish press often called a, quote, suicide epidemic, unquote. The Jewish press of the early 20th century saw in cities like Warsaw what they thought was a rise in suicides. and consequently began selling newspapers with flashy stories on Jewish suicides, with the goal of enticing readers, while completely ignoring any sense of morality concerning the sharing of such stories. Most articles on suicide in the Yiddish press were told in a sensational manner, even detailing where, when, and how a death took place. But certain articles did in fact provide moral criticism, along with suggestions on how to stop this epidemic. For Jewish leaders, the rise in suicides was a threat to modern Jewish society, like a spreading disease, one that needed to be eradicated. In order to battle the suicide epidemic in interwar Poland, Jewish rabbinical leaders turned to the cemetery, where they believed ritual and tradition could provide a solution. In the May 27th, 1925 issue of the Yiddish daily periodical Heint, the Warsaw Rabbinical Council submitted an article to appeal against the terrible stain of suicide in Poland. While there are many components of this appeal to analyze, it is their critique of the use of traditional burial practices for the suicidal that proves most compelling for this dissertation. On those who chose suicide, the articles of this article criticized, quote, people mourn them with pity and compassion. Their elaborate funerals are held for hours. They buy beautiful land at the cemetery. Such a heroic and compassionate attitude has undoubtedly caused the increase and perpetuation of the suicides, unquote. Ultimately, in this appeal, the Warsaw Rabbinical Council suggested that the funeral of one who chose suicide should not be held during the day, the number of people involved with the funeral should be limited, and their graves should be separated from others at the cemetery. Thus, these religious leaders saw that within the traditions of funeral and burial lay the power to control this suicide epidemic one way or another. In other articles, the Rabbinical Council agreed to specific rules regarding burial of those who chose suicide. First, the family should not sit shiva for the deceased. The body should be brought to the cemetery on their own, i.e. without a funeral procession. And finally, the burial society should not perform their traditional rites on the body. Even the Polish language press reported on Jewish suicides. One article notes that the Rabbinical Council decided to bury all those who died from suicide at the Jewish cemetery in the Praga neighborhood of Warsaw, in a designated section of this graveyard. These decisions would effectively separate Jewish people who chose suicide from all other Jewish deceased, both physically and traditionally. From the perspective of the rabbinic leaders, these decisions were an enforcement of tradition. As suicide was a sin, these decisions were a means of administrating Jewish law and stopping others from choosing suicide. However, another perspective on these decisions could suggest that the rabbis' proposals in effect contested Jewish tradition. Jewish burial and funerary practice contends that all Jews should be treated and buried equally in death. Even those that chose suicide in the interwar period advocated for traditional Jewish burials before their suicide. Jewish press that frequently published articles about suicide in Polish cities also consistently included the deceased's last notes to their loved ones. In one such article that described the suicide of a young Jewish woman in Warsaw, the letter addressed to her mother makes one request, quote, I am very much asking the Chesed Shel Emes to take care of my funeral, unquote. Chesed Shel Emes, a philanthropic burial organization in Warsaw, was known for providing equal treatment to deceased Varsovian Jews, particularly those that could not afford luxurious funerals. Those who chose suicide wanted traditional Jewish burials and often advocated such prior to their deaths. Here, the complexities of tradition show clearly. Varsovian Jews had different ideas about what constituted Jewish tradition. In this instance, in the midst of what they saw as a suicide epidemic, some Jews believed that the solution lay in the funerary traditions at the cemetery. Ultimately, the suicide epidemic of the interwar period led religious Jews to argue for the implementation of radical traditions concerning the cemetery, ones that contradicted other forms of traditional burial and funeral. From here, we move into the period of the Second World War, which brought irrevocable changes to Jewish funerary tradition. I wanted to start this section with the story of one such funeral that took place just as Nazi Germany bombed the city of Warsaw. In September 1939, Pella Starkov found herself in a very serious situation. Her city was under attack. Her husband Adam had left the city for the war front with no knowledge of whether he would ever return, and her mother-in-law had just died of a heart attack. What would she do with her mother-in-law's body? Pella's own mother ultimately convinced her that her mother-in-law deserved a proper burial. On the way to the cemetery with bombs flying overhead and bodies surrounding them, Pella stumbled, struggling to continue. Her mother turned to her and insisted, quote, "You must not lose control of yourself. You are performing an act of loving kindness. giving your husband's mother the last honor she deserves, so that she will rest in a proper Jewish grave. You will see. God will reward you for this by letting you live to see your husband again." Unquote. Despite heavy bombing, Adam's father and Pella's parents hired a horse-drawn wagon and made their way nearly a mile and a half through the city to the Jewish cemetery on Okapova Street. Adam's father considered it a sheer miracle that they made it to the cemetery at all. Their horse became skittish at the sound of explosions. They were forced to stop every few minutes to run for shelter from falling bombs. And at various moments in the journey, they came across bodies laying in the street. The small procession finally made it to the cemetery, where Pella's father quickly performed a burial ceremony. As Pella remembered, quote, "His words were almost drowned out by the deafening noise of the bombs and the anti-aircraft fire," unquote. Funerals continued and were a common part of everyday life during the Second World War and the Holocaust. Jews desperately wanted to provide their loved ones with, quote, "proper Jewish funerals." Even when performing funerary ritual was financially challenging and risked the lives of those mourning, Jews in occupied Poland were committed to the continuance of Jewish funerary ritual, not only due to individual insistence from loved ones, but also due to concerns over the ethical treatment of the Jewish dead. Ultimately, death rituals exacerbated class differences during the Holocaust, and as such, the unethical treatment of the bodies of the poor initiated returns to traditional funerary practices in the Jewish community. Families were often responsible for decisions concerning a loved one's funeral. However, it was also the case that individuals at times wrote of their own hopes for their own funeral, should they die during the war. A young man named Josef Pekis wrote in a letter to loved ones, quote, "If I am shot, may my father arrange a burial plot for me, a separate grave with new shrouds, everything as it should be," unquote. While it was important for many to be buried in a traditional manner, others yearned to be buried in traditional locations. Towards the end of 1939, the rabbi of the town of Sokolov-Pulaski died. In the town's Yizkor book, it is written that many Jewish men from the town risked their lives to carry the deceased rabbi to Warsaw in order to be buried at the Jewish cemetery on Okapova Street, where the former rabbis of the town had been buried. On the road to Warsaw, Germans attacked the men and drove them away from the road. The Jewish men hid in the forest surrounding the road until the Germans left the area, finally returning to the casket and continuing their journey to Warsaw, where they were able to bury their rabbi in the same section as other rabbis from their town. Jews in occupied Poland intensely desired traditional Jewish funerals for themselves and loved ones, often risking their own well-being to do so. Funerals were a part of everyday life in occupied Warsaw. As early as October 1939, Adam Chirnyakov, the chair of the Warsaw Jewish Council, regularly wrote about funerals in his daily journal. It is clear from these notes that funerals were commonplace in the Warsaw Ghetto, at least from October 1939 to June 1942. However, various changes to funerary practices occurred during the process of ghettoization in Warsaw. As Rabbi Shimon Huberbrand described in his recollections, during the first 6 months of the war, most funerals were actually held at the Brudno Jewish Cemetery in Warsaw. As this cemetery was located on the other side of the Wisła River in the Praga neighborhood, holding funerals at this location was quite challenging. Huberbrand describes that the road to the cemetery was dangerous, and the journey there would often take hours. Due to the danger on the road to Praga, the funeral processions for the deceased often took place on their own street, starting from their house and continuing to the end of the road. Formal funerals would then be held the following day at the Praga cemetery. On August 6, 1940, Chaim Kaplan, who had been a principal of a Hebrew school in Warsaw when the war broke out, wrote in his diary about how different Jewish funerals looked in occupied Warsaw. Quote, "Every great man or leader of his people who passes on in these evil times is carried to his grave alone, with his death and burial unknown to anyone. Since there are no newspapers, there is nowhere to publish death notices," unquote. Kaplan would become enraged with the changes to Jewish burial practices as the war went on. But this early entry in his diary signifies first, in this period prior to the establishment of the ghetto in Warsaw, that changes to Jewish funerary practices were already occurring, and second, that onlookers were beginning to be concerned with these changes. The establishment of the formal ghetto boundaries in October 1940 brought permanent changes to funerary processes in Warsaw. Just 1 month later, in November 1940, it was announced that the Praga cemetery would be closed permanently. And after this point, all funerals in the Warsaw Ghetto would need to take place at the Okapova Street Jewish Cemetery. From this point on, death and burial became commonplace in the ghetto. One report from the Warsaw Ghetto wrote that, quote, "Black Jewish hearses have become a factor of the everyday street scene," unquote. While some burials retained their traditional processes, most burials did not. One document from the Warsaw Ghetto showcases this well. The author of the document followed grave diggers around the ghetto as they picked up bodies to take to the cemetery. After removing a body from a basement, the author describes how, quote, the grave diggers carry the corpse out to the cart, take a swing, and toss the former human being back as far into the cart as possible so it does not occupy much space. There will, of course, be no casket, unquote. The observer comments on the people who emotionlessly watch the bodies of their loved ones being removed. Quote, death is too common a phenomenon here, unquote. For some of the deceased, formal funerals and memorial services were held. The publishing of Gazeta Żydowska enabled Jews in ghettos around the general government to share news of their loved one's death and funerals. Such notices were meant to inform the public of a loved one's death, but also share details on their funeral in hopes that friends and colleagues would be able to accompany the deceased to their grave. Private funeral homes, established in late 1940 in the Warsaw Ghetto, were also instrumental in the publishing of obituaries in newspapers or the posting of death notices on the streets. As the war continued, death was occurring with such frequency that memorial services were sometimes held for multiple people at the same time. In January 1942, the Jewish Council of the Warsaw Ghetto printed a notice for a communal memorial service held in the Nozick Synagogue for 6 of its members. Though funerals were held for many who died in the Warsaw Ghetto, for the majority of people imprisoned there, even a funeral was out of the question. By early 1941, some Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto began to be concerned with the treatment of Jewish corpses and lack of care surrounding burial practices. On March 13, 1941, Kaplan critiqued in his diary that as the funeral wagon goes by, quote, no one turns to watch it or pays any attention to the fact that in the coffin, which goes by at such a clip, lies one of the victims of starvation. Sometimes several corpses are placed in one coffin, one on top of the other, and all are taken for burial at one time, a wholesale business, unquote. The owner of a funeral home even reported the discovery of mutilated corpses to the Jewish Council in December 1941, noting that parts of a corpse appeared to have been bitten out. Mutilated corpses and the body marketplace that formed in the Warsaw Ghetto meant that the deceased lost their traditional importance and sanctity. It was such treatment of the dead that led to calls for the establishment of a burial society in the Warsaw Ghetto, composed of, quote, honorable and more honest citizens who would watch over the proper burying of corpses in accordance with principles of human and religious ethics, unquote. Though burial societies with this purpose had existed in Warsaw prior to the formation of the ghetto, the establishment of private funeral homes meant that the volunteer-driven burial societies of the past did not function in 1941. In fall of 1941, Nazi authorities announced alterations to the borders of the Warsaw Ghetto. After realizing that the inclusion of the Jewish cemetery on Okopowa Street within the boundary of the ghetto meant that Jews could use the site openly, specifically for smuggling. By December of that year, the Okopowa Street Jewish Cemetery would be formally excluded from the borders of the Warsaw Ghetto. This exclusion held lasting consequences for the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. In order to access the Jewish cemetery on Okopowa Street, Jews needed a pass to get through the gate. Passes to the cemetery allowed Jews to be able to attend funerals, though ease of access to such passes remains unclear. Kaplan's diary entry from March 7th, 1942 provides some insight into the use of such passes. Quote, free access to the Jewish cemetery is strictly forbidden. No one may enter unless he first buys an admission ticket costing 2.5 zloty, a new source of income for the German and Jewish vultures who stand guard at the gate because they suspect you came not to accompany the departed, but to engage in smuggling. During the Second World War, funerals highlighted prominent class differences among Jews. Even in the ghetto, some of the imprisoned Jews remained in better financial status than others. Wealth enabled some Jews to provide lavish funerals for their loved ones, while on the other hand, the poor were relegated to mass graves, often without coffins or shrouds. Emanuel Ringelblum, historian and organizer of the underground Oyneg Shabbos archive, described in his diary that the poor often threw the bodies of their loved ones into the street, as they did not have money for a burial. Kaplan describes 3 categories of corpses in the Jewish cemetery. The first are those that were brought to the Tahara room, or the ritual purification room at the cemetery. The second are those that were purified at home before being brought to the cemetery. And the final category includes those that died of starvation or disease. The corpses belonging to the first 2 categories are, quote, the fortunate ones who receive a halfway decent burial. Nowadays, that is a considerable privilege, unquote. Emanuel Ringelblum wrote about the disparity in burials in his journal from the Warsaw Ghetto on March 18th, 1941. Quote, "The corpses are laid in mass graves separated by boards. Most of the bodies brought to the graveyard from the hospital are buried naked. In the house I lived in, a father, mother, and son all died from hunger in the course of one day. Pinkyert, king of the dead, keeps opening new branches of his funeral parlors. He recently opened a branch on Smolchna Street where he offers burial in luxury, i.e. for 12 zlotys, you can have pallbearers in uniform." Unquote. Ringelblum seemed particularly distressed by the arising issues concerning burial of Jews in the ghetto. By May 1941, he described that they were running out of space to bury the dead. Cemetery workers dug so deep in the ground that they hit the water line and then ran out of dirt to fill over the mass grave. Mass graves became common features of Jewish cemeteries in occupied Poland. They were necessary either due to the sheer number of corpses accumulating in a ghetto or town with no ability to bury them individually because of a lack of time, space, or money, or, as was very common, Nazis created mass graves to bury those killed in massacres. Even as some funerals were able to continue in the Okapova Street Jewish Cemetery, Jews in the ghetto were increasingly concerned with the treatment of corpses in the ghetto, explicitly the corpses of the poor. Such concerns were formally brought to the Jewish Council of the Warsaw Ghetto in spring 1942. In a letter written to the chairman of the Jewish Council, a group of Orthodox activists described the state of Jewish burials in the ghetto, quote, "One of the most important and most painful problems in the life of the Jewish population in Warsaw in our time is the problem of desecration of corpses, which has recently gained alarming proportions. In a very short period of time, the basic rules of ethics and tradition in relation to a deceased Jew, which have been practiced by the people of Israel for thousands of years, have been broken." Particularly, this letter called out the treatment of the deceased as so mediocre, quote, "that death does not free him from the difficulty of life anymore, but the moment he dies and the tragedy of his life comes to an end, the tragedy of his death begins," unquote. This letter advocated for the creation of a group called the Benevolent Association for the Burial of the Dead, which would assist the poor of the ghetto with funeral preparations and transportation of bodies to the cemetery. Just a few months later, the Great Deportation of the Warsaw Ghetto would begin. It is unclear whether any of these calls for burial organizations were fulfilled. This section in no way intends to argue that burial and funerary processes were of primary concern to Jews living in Nazi-occupied Poland during the Second World War. However, issues like the burial of the poor, treatment of corpses, and one's own death plans did weigh on the minds of many Jews during this time. While most certainly treated their own survival with utmost priority over the treatment of the dead, many took on incredible risks to provide loved ones with the last honor. Some spent their limited money on funerals, while others traversed dangerous roads and cross-guarded boundaries to get to the cemetery. The calamity of the Holocaust exacerbated class differences in a variety of ways, but especially so when it came to death, dying, and burial. These differences meant that it was almost impossible for the poor to get a traditional Jewish funeral, a reality that often emotionally afflicted the living. Some Jews called out this great hypocrisy when noting the neglect of the bodies of the poor in the ghetto, expressing that, quote, "the rules of the Jewish order provide for equal treatment, which always left an impression of great respect on those who accompanied the deceased to eternal rest," unquote. This equality, such as the use of simple shrouds and pine coffins, so that all Jews would be equal in death, disappeared during the war. Suddenly, those equalizers were only available to those who could afford them. As Kaplan expressed in his diary, quote, "In darkness they lived, in darkness they died, and in darkness they were buried. Is this man, and is this his end?" Unquote. In the final section of this talk, I will discuss the concept of the Black Wedding and its relation to Jewish tradition during the Holocaust. During the Second World War, the town of Zhelechów, like many others at the time, faced a dangerous typhus epidemic. So dangerous that survivors recalled that few who contracted the disease would actually recover. The town leadership convened, discussing possible solutions to stop the epidemic. Ultimately, the leaders decided to return to a ritual steeped in Jewish tradition, the Black Wedding. As a survivor recalls, quote, "It was decided to attempt all the remedies which were known to those present at the meeting. At the meeting, it was also decided to arrange a wedding at the cemetery," unquote. This ritual, in which marginal people were married in the town cemetery in order to end an epidemic, has a long history in East European Jewish life, but had not been utilized in these regions since the typhus outbreaks of the First World War. The Black Wedding is a ritual steeped in spiritualism, mysticism, and tradition that exemplifies Jewish beliefs about the cemetery and the role it played in Jewish communities in Poland. Analysis of this ritual allows historians to delve into discussions concerning the connections between modernity and tradition. Whereas the Black Wedding in the 19th century was seen as a traditionalist reaction to modernity, the performance of the Black Wedding in the Second World War draws into question the typical division of tradition and modernity. The performance of the Black Wedding extends back to the 1830s in the Russian Empire, historically taking place during waves of cholera epidemics in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. For Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, such a ceremony would bring favor with the dead, and through their intervention, encourage the creator to bring an end to an epidemic. The Black Wedding is not a well understood ritual by any means. Where it originated and why are questions that may never be fully answered. Ultimately, scholars believe that the Black Wedding is an amalgamation of different rituals and traditional beliefs. As weddings are considered mitzvot in Jewish law, the marriage of two people who may not otherwise ever be married would certainly be considered a good deed for the community and may bring greater favor from God. There is also a history of Jewish people connecting with God to heal loved ones at the cemetery. The Black Wedding then seems to be a mix of some of these beliefs that this mitzvah, taking place at the border between the natural world and the spiritual, would bring an end to the epidemic the town was facing. By the early 20th century, cholera epidemics made way to typhus epidemics. And though the rituals performed to end them were still at times called cholera weddings, Black weddings were also performed in response to typhus epidemics between 1910 and 1920. The town of Sielce was one such town that found itself in the middle of a typhus epidemic during the First World War. Due to the raging disease, some Jews in the community, quote, sought a charm to stop the epidemic through a wedding in the cemetery, unquote. In this case, a wedding was held between Yiddle the porter and a, quote, mute girl in the old cemetery in Sielce. The town of Kowushin also held a Black wedding during this time period. A survivor from the town recalls that, quote, a wedding was arranged at the cemetery between two insane people. Supposedly, this event was going to stop the epidemic. Of course, the entire Jewish population went to the wedding at the cemetery, where the unfortunate couple was being married between all the tombstones. The youngsters tried to be in the forefront to watch the ceremony, unquote. Despite some skepticism from the witness, and surely skepticism from others involved, the ceremony drew the entire community together in a time of crisis. Though most scholarship on Black weddings ends after the First World War, the tradition in fact resurfaced with the start of World War II. There seem to have been at least two instances where Black weddings were held, or in the least considered, during the Second World War. The first and only known example of a Black wedding that was actually performed is the Black wedding in Zhelehov. After finally deciding to host a wedding in the cemetery, the town searched far and wide for an appropriate couple, finally settling on a young man named Motala and and a woman over 50 years old who lived on the street. They agreed to be married so long as the community provided them with clothes, shoes, and money to support them after the wedding. Nearly every resident of the ghetto joined the wedding procession to the cemetery, though the author notes a, quote, bitter mood to the occasion, unquote. The rabbi performed the ceremony, which included many prayers that were intended to ward off the epidemic. There was also an attempt to host a Black wedding in the Warsaw Ghetto. On September 28, 1941, a rabbinical congregation wrote a letter to the Department of Religious Affairs in the Jewish Council over concerns about the ongoing typhus epidemic in the ghetto. Quote, because the epidemic is raging in our cities, spreading day by day, we suggest as a religious right of remedy to arrange the marriage of a bachelor and a spinster, both poor, in the cemetery, immediately after the upcoming Day of Atonement, at the expense of the community. This right is researched and tested, and with God's help, it will certainly result in an end to the epidemic. Included with the first letter from the rabbinical congregation is a letter written by Dr. Meyer Bauerban, a renowned historian. In his letter to the head of the Judenrat, Dr. Bauerban's letter supported the performance of the Black wedding in the Warsaw Ghetto by providing the historical provenance of such ceremonies. He wrote that weddings in cemeteries were popular from the medieval era to the 19th century. He also asserted knowledge of a possible Black wedding held in his hometown, Lviv, in 1918. This document is unique for many reasons. First, no other formal documentation requesting to host a Black wedding during the Holocaust exists. This letter, then, is the only of its kind. Additionally, Dr. Bauerban's support of the rabbinical congregation's request is compelling on its own. While he did not explicitly state whether he believed the Black Wedding would prove efficacious, he utilized Jewish history to connect the performance of this ritual to the present. Though these letters were sent at the end of September 1941, it is not clear exactly when they reached the Jewish Council in Warsaw, though Chernyakov mentioned receiving this letter in his diary on October 27, 1941. What is clear is that the suggestion was evidently passed along to the most prominent leaders of the ghetto, and they received it. However, it is not known whether the ritual was ever carried out. On February 12, 1942, Chernyakov commented once again on the proposed Black Wedding in his journal, quote, "I was inoculated yesterday for the second time against typhus. The blood tests showed a negative reaction, which indicates that I could contract the disease. Several months ago, the rabbis proposed that a marriage ceremony be performed in the cemetery. This is supposed to bring about the end of the epidemic. The scientists who do the blood testing and at the same time declare that neither a positive or a negative reaction is conclusive are as helpful as the above mentioned rabbis," unquote. From this quote, it is clear where Chernyakov fell in his belief about the effectiveness of the Black Wedding. Many Jews of this period probably felt similar to him, believing that the ritual would not actually bring about the end of epidemics in their community. In Zhelehov, the Black Wedding was one of many, quote, remedies that the community attempted to try to end the spread of the disease. In such desperation, whether the community believed in this ritual did not matter. It was worth a try. As the majority of Black weddings took place in the 19th century, they are often discussed as a part of a tradition to modernity ongoing in that period. In his groundbreaking work, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, Natan Meir ends his discussion of the Black Wedding prior to the start of the Second World War. In an analysis that spans the 19th century and the first few decades of the 20th, Meir argues that the Black Wedding served as a form of traditionalist reaction to modernity. As enlightened medical practices spread to the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, often through public health officials that Jews saw as outsiders, Jews then held even tighter to their own traditions to fight against illness and death. Can we apply the same thinking to the Black weddings of the Holocaust? Were they a traditionalist reaction to modernity? This is a complicated question to answer. On the one hand, it could be argued that if modernity had first arrived to Eastern Europe in the mid to late 19th century, then certainly modernity was already in practice by the Second World War. How could the Black wedding still be a reaction to modernity? On the other hand, some scholars have argued that the Holocaust was the result of modern bureaucratic civilization, even the ultimate example of such. Maybe the Black wedding was thus a reaction to this ultimate form of modernity, where Jews found themselves reaching far back to the traditions of the past for assistance. Regardless, it seems that Jewish communities often utilize rituals of the past to help them deal with the tragedy of the present. And it is also evident that modernity and tradition were occurring at the same time in the same places. While these terms often end up being used in opposition to one another, here we see that modernity and tradition were not antithetical. Tradition was actually part and parcel of modernity. To briefly conclude, this presentation examined 4 moments of tradition in Polish Jewish history across 2 time periods. First, we saw how Jewish funerals in the interwar period often abandoned Jewish traditions in favor of those that played into their political affiliations in life. Then we investigated how rabbinical congregations in the interwar period attempted to solve the suicide epidemic by implementing radical funerary traditions, some that can be seen as antithetical to Jewish tradition. The next section explored how funerary tradition changed with the onset of World War II, leading to activism concerning Jewish tradition and ethics. Finally, this talk engaged with the Black wedding, where an unusual Jewish tradition was reclaimed during the Holocaust. Again, analyzing tradition is complicated. Everyone's definition of what constitutes tradition might be different. But here, I attempted to examine tradition through the perspectives of those in the past. These Polish Jews were consistently considering tradition, whether they outwardly claim so or not. During the interwar period, Polish Jews were deciding which traditions should be utilized in their funerals, often including secular or Christian ones over Jewish ones. At the same time, rabbinical congregations were seeing a problem with Jewish tradition surrounding burial. To them, equal treatment of those that chose suicide was a significant factor in the epidemic spread. It is possible then to see shifts away from traditionalism in the interwar period, at least when examining Jewish funerary ritual. Jews that experienced the Holocaust also considered tradition, even when it may have put their own life at risk to do so. In this case, when faced with the unethical treatment of corpses, Jewish activists pushed for traditionalism in burial. Thus, the cemetery was a significant space for Jewish communities between 1918 and 1945. It was a site of negotiation of identity and consideration of tradition. a place where the dead actually influenced how the living understood their own Jewishness. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. That was really quite compelling. I think that, death is something that is, endlessly interesting for a lot of people. Obviously, it was interesting for you. And I just want to begin the questions by asking how you developed an interest in this topic and how you've gone about researching it.
Sure. So my family were Polish Jews, so it starts there. My mom and I went on our first trip to Poland in 2012 to kind of learn more about our ancestors that had immigrated from there. But really, I've been interested in cemeteries my whole life. I actually realized recently that I did an 8th grade history project on cemeteries in the state of Maryland, which is where I'm from. So it's always been an intriguing place for me in space. But I first visited the Warsaw Okopowa Street Jewish Cemetery in that trip in 2012. And if you've been there, it's a pretty incredible space. And it made a lasting impact on me. And visiting these cemeteries has led to a lot of questions for me. I wasn't always just interested in what the inscriptions on the gravestones meant, but I wanted to know who utilized these spaces, right? Who were the people utilizing cemeteries? And I've been able to find a lot of answers in this from newspaper articles. I've done some archival research in Poland at the Jewish Historical Institute, at the Archive of New Files, at the State Archive in Lublin, and been able to kind of piece together at least this first chapter so far on ritual, but hopefully some future chapters on space and the people that utilize cemeteries.
One of the things I noticed is that you did use, you showed them there's some of the newspaper articles that you looked at, and obviously with suicide that was a major issue especially during the 1920s and 30s. And it's, really quite interesting to see how the Jewish community addressed this. You mentioned that that rabbis came up with sort of innovations in halakha in order to try to stop this, plague of suicides. Was there precedence for that? Do you know how they developed that?
I really don't. To me, this a lot of the focus on this kind of suicide epidemic in the Yiddish press has been about the Yiddish press itself and how it kind of sensationalized these stories. That's been a lot of the scholarly work done on these Jewish suicides. But of course, for me, what's significant is that the rabbis saw the answer to this in what was happening at the cemetery, and that maybe they should not be treated equally in death. And I have not seen this elsewhere. Of course, I think, again, this kind of goes back to some of kind of what I was trying to argue here about tradition, that tradition is so complicated because people see it differently. And the rabbis were seeing one aspect of this as most important, right? The taking of one's life as being more significant than the traditions at the cemetery that are traditional or even part of law, right? So I have not seen this prior, but my research really focuses on the 20th century. And so it would be interesting to see if anyone from the 19th century historical side would know more.
Right. And also, in regards to tradition, the cemetery is run, to my understanding, by the Warsaw Kehila, by the Warsaw Jewish Community Council. And they make the rules, and they have a rabbinical section that deals with this, and they have the Chevra Kadisha that deals with all of this stuff. And so one of the things you showed that was really interesting was all of photos of these funerals of Bundists and Zionists, of all these secular people who are sort of integrating all these secular aspects into ritual, into this sort of traditional ritual. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of friction between the administrators of the cemetery and these sort of secular Jewish political groups who were in spite of their secularism were burying their dead in a Jewish cemetery. How did that play out?
So unfortunately, in the case of Warsaw, the Warsaw cemetery records were destroyed during the war. And so a lot of these questions we will never really know the answer to. But there was a lot of conflict over these issues. The kind of public aspect of the funeral really started in the late 19th century, actually mid to late 19th century, in places like Warsaw, where Jews kind of had these massive funerals in the streets, and some of that conflict started there, right? Just the such a large congregation of Jews in the public streets of the city led to often conflict between Jews and outsiders, right? Jews and non-Jews. The police were often involved. So there were these great congregations were seen as kind of maybe threats to Polish society as well. But then during the interwar period, we really see this kind of heightened political identification with these funerals and the implementation of these rituals. And we do have some evidence of the Kahila, getting into this argument with the Polish Socialist Party over, pushing the Kadalfek in front of the hearse. So they attempted to mediate some of this conflict prior, but then the funerals became these kind of spectacles on their own, and maybe people got out of control at some of them.
Right. One other question I want to ask about, you talked a couple times about rabbis from smaller shtetl who wanted to be buried in Warsaw.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was this a tradition that goes back a long ways. I think in some cases it was based on which towns had cemeteries on their own. Some Polish small towns did not have their own cemetery, and then their dead would have to be buried in the nearest or the closest by. And I think now the Warsaw Cemetery was only established in 1806, so it's actually not one of these like older cemeteries. But there was a tradition established with burying these kind of dynasties of Hasidic leaders at the Okopowa Street Cemetery. It was again where the Warsaw Kahila was kind of centered. And the Warsaw Kahila did also make decisions concerning other Jewish cemeteries, at least in that region as well. And so this kind of tradition of being buried in the same place as other former rabbis of your town took place and happened there.
Right. And the last question I'll ask before we get to audience questions is, you talked about the Black Wedding and sort of folkloric, ritual. Does your dissertation also deal with grave measuring?
I haven't found that much on it yet, so it's a kind of, I'm like not doing that yet. But there's so much that I can dive into with funerals and tradition and burials. But yeah, not yet.
Okay.
Maybe
All
if
right.
I find more.
Just curious, because there's all this folklore around, death and mourning and
Yeah.
cemeteries, which seemed like an interesting topic.
Yeah, no, it is.
Right. All right. So let's get some audience questions. Lily Albaum was asking if you could comment on the uniqueness of the large ghetto field where everyone is buried in an individual grave, and there were no mass graves, as you discussed with Warsaw.
Sure. I will be looking at the Łódź ghetto in some parts of my dissertation. So as much as I know right now, the Łódź Jewish Council had a pretty significant funerary department. And this was, well, the Warsaw did as well, but it seems that their records are more preserved and that they maybe had a little bit more structure to their council than the Warsaw's council was. But it's I haven't really dug into those files yet, but I have them. And so I think part of the answer lies in the structure of the funerary department within the Jewish Council in Łódź, but I haven't really gotten all the way there with my research yet. But thank you,
Right.
Lily.
And someone is saying or commenting that their mother escaped the Warsaw Ghetto apparently by hiding in one of the hearses with the dead that the Chevra Kadisha were bringing to the Okopowa Cemetery. They ask if this is plausible. I mean, if this is their memory, I assume it must have been. But the question is, did people actually escape the ghetto in this way? I do know, I did recently read that people were living and hiding in the cemetery during the war. So, maybe you could comment on that as well.
Yeah, so that's actually a big part of my dissertation. there have been quite a few stories of people escaping the Warsaw Ghetto through, like your mother in hearses with dead bodies. One story that the Starkoffs, who I talk about a little bit in this presentation, who buried their mother-in-law, their mother in early 1939, they end up escaping the Warsaw Ghetto through the cemetery. And they end up drugging their daughter so that she appears to be dead. They get a hearse and the whole funeral process. They take her to the gate at the Jewish cemetery, and they end up being able to escape the Warsaw Ghetto through the cemetery. So yes, this was very plausible. To me, what is so fascinating about these stories of escape is because of the location of the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. As I showed with some of the maps here, the cemetery was in a prime location, both within the Warsaw Ghetto, and then it was also formally excluded. So we have people moving in and out of the Jewish cemetery as soon as the ghetto was established in 1940 for smuggling purposes. People figured out that this was a prime route for smuggling, particularly smuggling of large goods. So cows and horses being brought into the Warsaw Ghetto through the cemetery. And eventually the Nazi authorities changed the borders to the ghetto. One change being that the Okopowa Street Cemetery is no longer inside the ghetto, but there is now a gate that you would have to pass through. And so this complicates people's ability to escape or hide, as Eddie, as you suggested, but they did continue to happen. It just meant that people had to be a little bit more clever and get papers in place or bribe guards. This happened more often than I think we would think, but it became a prime space for escape and hiding, which is one of the first things that made me interested in this. But to me, it's about the space and the location of the cemetery that enabled these things to happen. Yeah.
Right. And David Goldstein is asking if Jews were buried with soil from Israel during this period in Poland, which is another ritual that was fairly common.
Right. It was fairly common. It's not explicitly mentioned in a lot of stories about burials that I've heard. I've read a lot of stories about, the burial with earth or with soil. Whether it explicitly says Israel or Palestine, it does not. So I have not seen it. I assume that it would happen for some, but probably not all. But it's not explicitly stated in a lot of the sources I'm seeing.
Right. And lastly, we have a question from David Dubo. He asks, while you focus on Poland, do you believe other Jewish communities in Ukraine, Hungary, and elsewhere followed these practices? I would imagine they did, although I'll let you answer. And it says, was it against beliefs to keep burial records?
Yeah, so I think these were pretty common Jewish practices across Eastern Europe. In this time period, we definitely see differences in burial tradition in cities versus in small towns. And so I would think the same would be the case in Ukraine, in places like Hungary. And also, it was not against Jewish beliefs to keep burial records. They were actually very meticulous with burial records. We have quite a few different types of organizations involved in keeping burial records. The Jewish community kept some. If there was a burial society, if there was a Hever Kadisha, they would keep burial records or even death records. And then there were these volunteer burial societies, often called Chesed Shel Emes or some other name, that would also keep records. And so it was not against beliefs, and it was a part of their practice and kind of monitoring, I think, their community and their cemetery.
Right. All right. Well, that wraps it up. Thanks so much to Alison Curry. She's been the recipient of the YIVO Fellowship in Polish Jewish Studies, which is funded by the Alexander and Alicia Hertz Memorial Fellowship and the Samuel and Flora Weiss Research Fellowship. If you enjoyed this talk, please consider making a donation to YIVO. We can't bring these fellowship lectures, and we can't support Jewish studies scholars without your help. So we'd appreciate that very much. Additionally, we have a number of fellowship lectures coming up the next few weeks. So if you'd like to see more, please check our schedule at yivo.org to have a look to see if there's something you would enjoy. And once again, thanks to Alison Curry.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve.